Good morning and good afternoon to those of you that see noon as either a morning or an afternoon. So I'm Judy Lloyd. I am the president and CEO of the Danville Area Chamber of Commerce, and I'm here today to welcome our special guests from the town of Danville, our leadership, should I say, from the town of Danville. Diane Friedman is someone that I've worked with for years on legislative issues, including housing, and we've had many, many deep discussions on this. And Dave Crompton, who works in planning at the town. And then also Diana Elrod is with us, who's a specialist on housing issues. So we're really honored today to be working with them on the Housing Element 101 workshop. And before I kick it off, I just want to say something, and this is really absolutely true. Our town of Danville has done more due diligence on the state issues, state mandates, and things which force towns and cities and communities to build a certain amount of housing. Diane, Dave had been at the forefront of this and their teams of actually taking a serious look, and have led the charge in the East Bay to try to do the right thing. And so I think it's really important today that everybody understand we have, you know, the experts in our community who are going to present this to us and who are going to give us an opportunity to ask questions. So Diane, I think you're kicking it off this morning, so go for it.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for the nice introduction, Judy. And good afternoon and welcome to Danville's Housing 101 workshop. As Judy mentioned, my name's Diane Friedman. I'm the Deputy Director of Development Services. We're joined by Dave Crompton, who's Danville's Chief of Planning. Dave's division actually just oversees this whole housing element process. And then Diana Elrod, who is the consultant that's working with us on the housing element update process. We are so pleased to have a conversation with you today about housing, as what happens on this subject right now, as Judy had mentioned a little earlier, it is now more and more being governed by state laws, and we will touch a little bit about that in the presentation. Next slide, please. As an overview, and throughout this presentation, if you have your phone and you want to make a note of the number in the left-hand portion of your slide, you can text your ideas, your Danville housing stories to us, your experience with housing in Danville, directly to a website that we are using as a portal to gather community feedback. As an overview, the intent of this workshop is to inform, and we'll cover three primary areas. The first is the background and context to the housing element and what is impacting decisions around this housing element update process. Two, we will share probably more than you've ever wanted to know about the housing element, but I say we're afraid to ask. And then three, really just talk to you about how you can participate in the process, because we are reaching out to as many community members as possible throughout this process. We want everybody's input on this process. It is very important, especially, our businesses, because these decisions will have an impact, and we want to hear from everybody throughout this process. So we will cover the why, the what, the how, and the who, and also the roles of the elected and appointed town officials that will be making the ultimate decisions around this. And lastly, we will be here as long as it takes to answer any questions that you may have about this process. Next slide, please. We'd like to set the stage for the discussion with some of the background and the context between housing trends and what's happening in the state. Next slide, please. And really start by acknowledging that for a long time now, it's been very expensive to live in California. That is absolutely no secret. If you look at the statistics, in a report by the State Legislative Analyst Office. And the State Legislative Analyst Office is a nonpartisan office in the state legislature that does a lot of analysis around upcoming pending legislation, fiscal impacts, and what is happening in California. And these are the latest statistics that we have. It illustrates the disparity between California's housing costs and the rest of the nation has grown dramatically over the decades and continues to do so. When we have updated figures, we will present them to you, and you will see that the disparity is growing. As of the 1940s, California was 20% above the US as far as home prices. In the 80s, 80% above. In 2015, 150% above the US. And as recently as 2019, 218% above the US as far as home prices. And you can also see on the right-hand side, the rents and the disparity is growing between California and the rest of the country. Next slide, please. The legislative analysts report also concludes that growth in housing is the result of a housing supply shortage. If you look at this graph, really what you're seeing is starting from the 1940s, the trends for California and the housing shortage, especially along the coast, the housing supply has dropped significantly, and it has started to move inland. Most of the major cities in California are on the coast, but as you see, that land supply and housing supply has really started to move outward because of affordability issues. Commutes are longer. The housing costs are really pushing people outward and inward. Next slide, please. The legislative analyst report also concludes, and it's reflected in a 2018 report by HCD, which is the State Department of Housing and Community Development, that the number of permits issued for housing units, it's a leading indicator of housing construction, really has never recovered from the Great Recession. If you look at this in closer context, in the 60s, the housing permits, which are an indicator of, housing starts and housing development, the most we've seen is a little over 300,000 units per year. In 2008, the Great Recession, it dropped down significantly, and we have never recovered. We're hovering as a state at about 80,000 housing units per year on average. And what's even more startling is that even from the multifamily housing starts are significantly lower, which all of this is creating a housing supply shortage in the state. Next slide, please. And as we continue to evaluate housing trends, the question begs, why don't we build more housing? The top 5 reasons why is community resistance. People don't want traffic and noise and, love their communities to be quiet. Commercial development drives more tax revenue, more profitability. So there's more incentive to build commercial development because it brings in more local tax revenue. There's also limited land to build on. The cost of development is skyrocketing. It's significantly high, and the limit or the supply that we need is low and extremely low income housing. It costs the same amount to build a market rate house than it does to build a lower, extremely low income housing. So, developers, builders need to be incentivized to create the type of housing that California needs. Also, project reviews and CEQA, have really delayed or reduced new housing. All of this adds to where we are right now as far as the housing supply shortage. Next slide, please. Prior to the pandemic, housing production was a central focus for Governor Gavin Newsom, whose inaugural address included a goal of building 3.5 million housing units by 2025. And if you look at the permit graph that I just showed you, it is virtually impossible with 80,000 units per year on average to reach that goal by 2025. It's a stretch goal at best. That means the entire state would need to produce over 850,000 units annually in the next 4 years, far more than we have ever built in the state before. Next slide, please. So what is happening at the state level as housing shortage is continuing to be an issue? The state has really looked at this, and it has become a priority over the last 4 to 5 years for the state legislature to start legislating housing productivity. Over 64 bills have been passed over the past 4 years that are intended to expedite housing construction. In 2021 alone, 28 bills have been introduced, with Senate Bill 9 receiving press attention given its intent to eliminate single-family zoning, and the governor just signed that into law 2 weeks ago. It will take effect on January 1st of 2022. SB 9, what the Department of HCD indicates is that about 65% of zoned land in California is locked up in single family zoning, and SB 9's intent is to unlock that land and create what is called missing middle or gentle density to really unlock single family residential zoning. And it's all around housing production. The state wants to produce housing. So if there's one takeaway from part 1 of this workshop, it is that state laws now, not local laws now, increasingly govern how cities must review, approve, and plan for housing. Really want to make a point that this is not in any way about housing, because we do recognize that there is a housing shortage. It's the type of housing that is needed, and our local government officials, your council members, and the ability of Danville to really continue our community character to build that housing that's needed at the local level. And with that, with the social political context that I've just reviewed with you, I'll transition to Diana. She's going to really dive into the nuts and bolts of the housing element and what it means to Danville.
Thanks, Diane. Next slide. So why do we need a housing element anyway? And the short answer is to comply with state law that was enacted way back in 1969. And this law acknowledges that cities do not build housing, but instead it requires each city to accommodate its fair share of the state's projected housing needs by planning for growth and by removing constraints to growth. Next slide, please. But as Diane noted earlier, a growing number of recently adopted state laws now collectively constrain how cities develop their housing elements. We'll talk a little bit more about that. These are just some of the new rules in place in the last few years that have made changes to how we plan for housing. Next slide. And what is a housing element anyway? It's a plan that demonstrates to the state of California, because they have to approve it, how we would accommodate the housing that is needed in our community. The key here is that the state and regional agencies, not the town, determine what the need is. And it also must be updated every 8 years, this housing plan. This is the only element of the general plan that has to be approved by the state. The period that we are developing a plan for is from 2023 to 2031. Next slide, please. So what's in it anyway? There's a housing plan with goals, policies, and objectives, an analysis of needs, and evaluations of constraints, both governmental and non-governmental constraints to the production of housing, and the identification of sites where housing might be located. This is perhaps the most controversial. However, it's important to note that people who may have their site identified as a potential housing site will always have the opportunity to either decide they want to develop their property or not. So the decision is always up to the owner. Next slide, please. The foundation for the housing element is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, also pronounced RHNA. You probably heard this before. Involves 3 levels of government: At the state level, the role is to produce housing projections every 8 years statewide. These targets are then assigned to regions within California, in this case, the Bay Area. And the state assigned the Bay Area 441,176 units total for this cycle for the 9-county Bay Area. Note, this is more than twice the size it was the last housing element cycle. At the regional level, the regional planning agency, we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, they allocate that assignment to the cities and counties within its region. And then at the local level, at the very end of the process, local cities and counties play a role to find the land to accommodate all these units potentially for their assignment. Again, it's not a mandate to build, it's a mandate to plan for housing. Next slide, please. So what does it mean for Danville? Right now, it means we have to find parcels for a minimum of 2,241 new units for the 8-year planning period that begins in 2023. And note, this is a minimum assignment, and there'll be a little bit more explanation on that later. Next slide. Danville's housing assignment, it's important to note it's not just 2,241 single-family houses, but rather homes that must be affordable in 4 income categories. And each income category is benchmarked to a percentage of the county's area median income. And as a reference point, Contra Costa's AMI, area median income for a family of 4, is $119,000 plus per year. And at the one end of the spectrum, a very low income family of 4 earns 50% of the median, in which case this is about $65,000 per year. And at the other end of the spectrum, an above moderate income family of 4 earns in excess of $143,000 a year. And the income categories matter because higher density zone land is necessary to reach the lower incomes to provide units affordable to low and very low income households. And this typically comes in terms of multifamily housing, not single family housing. For example, the units affordable to the lowest income categories have to be built at least 30 units to the acre. Next slide, please. We won't go through this in great detail, but this shows you on the right-hand column the total number of units assigned to each community within Contra Costa County. Note that Concord has 5,000 units. The unincorporated area of Contra Costa received 7,600 units. Richmond got 3,600 units, and then Danville itself got about 2,241 units. Next slide, please. You might ask, who gave us this assignment? It's the San Francisco Bay Area's regional planning agency is called the Association of Bay Area Governments, and it's pronounced ABAG. And one of ABAG's responsibilities to develop a methodology for distributing the 441,000 units to its 101 cities and 9 counties. Next slide, please. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, and I want to make sure you know that we didn't make this graphic, but essentially the main factors that were involved in the methodology were split between income categories. On the left-hand side, you can see very low and low income categories. The allocation factors included access to high opportunity areas. These are areas in which there are high-performing schools, access to transit, other quality amenities, libraries, and so forth. Also on the very low income side, very low and low income side, job proximity either by auto or by transit also factored into the distribution model. And on the right-hand side, moderate income and above moderate income housing units, these allocation factors were primarily less focus on high opportunity areas and more focus on job proximity by auto. The presumption being higher incomes tend to not use public transit nearly as much. Next slide, please. And some have already asked, I'm sure it's in your minds, but what's at stake for noncompliance? What happens if the town decides not to comply? Unfortunately, it means limited access to state funding. There are a number of funding sources, including transportation dollars that we use to repave and repair roads. These are tied to whether or not we have a complying housing element. If we don't have a complying housing element, we decide not to follow the rules, the court can impose fines up to $600,000 per month. And even if Danville residents were willing to forego this funding and willing to pay the fines, the legal risk is, and loss of local control means that courts can mandate compliance. Courts can approval of housing developments with no input from the community. And it's essentially suspending the town's ability to issue building permits. Next slide, please. With this, I'm going to turn it over to Dave for a case study in housing development.
Great, thank you, Diana, and good afternoon, everybody. So Diana previously showed you the slide that showed our total RHNA assignment, which was 2,241. And about half of those are in the categories of low and very low income, which means they have to be at least 30 units an acre. So I wanted to kind of go through a case study here to show the significant challenges we have in Danville and other communities like Danville in fulfilling the low and very low requirement. So the case study is the Lexon Riverwalk. Probably all familiar with this. This is the 144 unit apartment project that was built down on Danville Road by the on-ramp. And this was a site that was actually redesignated as part of our last housing element, RHNA needs, to capture the number of units we needed last time. And so it was redesignated from an office use to a multifamily housing use that required a density of 25 to 30 units per acre. One of the many state laws that Diana had on her list earlier is a law called state density bonus. It basically says that if a developer commits to providing a certain level of affordability for some of the units, they have a right to a density bonus, more units. So in this case, they ended up with 144 units. 10 of them were required to be deed restricted to be very low income units, but the rest of them, 134 are all renting at market rate. And in Danville, at market rate, even for these apartment units, they're renting at about $2,600 to almost $5,000 a month. And so that comes into, leads into another state law that was on that list. That's called the no net loss law. That basically says that if you had a project that was in your housing element that you said was going to help you supply your RHNA assignment at a certain income level, and a project that was built didn't do that for you, you have to turn around and make up those units. Those are basically considered lost units. You have to make those up somewhere else. So it's a little bit complicated, but before the density bonus, we were expecting up to 113 low and very low units here as part of that project. I only got 10, so that means that up to 103 additional units have to be added on to that 1,241 number that we showed you earlier. And you can see where that's going to be a problem over and over again in Danville. You know, even if we designate properties at 30 units an acre or more, and the Lexon Riverwalk turned out to be about 40 units an acre, even at those densities, they're not affordable at market rate. So as Diane said earlier, without some type of state intervention or subsidies, it's going to be difficult going forward. And that's why another state law or part of the housing element requires that we provide a buffer in addition to the 2,241. So that basically takes care of or tries to address this issue where you might fall short on certain sites. You have a buffer. So instead of the 2,241, we've designated an additional 20 or 30% of units that we found that, that we've redesignated somewhere in town to provide for those units going forward. We use a term called housing cost burden, and that basically means that a household should not have to pay more than 30% of their household income towards mortgage or rent or housing, including utilities. And so if they do have to spend more than 30%, then they would be considered cost burdened, and they wouldn't necessarily have enough money for other needs and wants. So we did a little study here on existing developments of some of our multifamily projects here in Danville. These are probably built over the last 20 years or so. And you can see in the very low category, if we're applying the cost burdening factor of 30% to afford any of these apartment projects in Danville, they would be extremely cost burdened, up to 78% on the Alexon Riverwalk. Even at low, there's some would be affordable without being cost burdened at low income levels, but a lot of them not. And then we have more at the moderate level, which is 80 to 120% of the county median income. So the majority of those would be affordable to a moderate income household without cost burdening. But importantly, if you look at the Alexon Riverwalk, which is the one I just talked about, and it's the most recent and reflects the current land values and development costs in Danville. And so you can see at market rate, even at moderate, they're not affordable without cost burdening. And so that means that you'd have to have a moderate, your family or household would have to have an above moderate income to afford to live in that apartment project without cost burdening. So participating in the process. So, hopefully we're piquing, if not piquing your interest, then maybe you're becoming a little bit concerned because this is something that our community is going to have to try to figure out in the course of the next year. And so it's really important, we felt all through this process, to reach out to the community and get as much involvement and as much factual information and knowledge out to the community as we can about this process. And so far, I think we've set up a very nice website that Diane's going to talk a little bit more about in a minute, but it provides questions and answers and links to some of the state legislation, as well as FAQ and that type of information. So that's hopefully be helpful. We've been doing these planning 101 webinars all summer and now into the fall. So we've done about a dozen of these, and we've also had individual, as we are today with the chamber group, we've reached out and had these seminars with a number of community groups over the last 4 or 5 months. So going forward, we are working on our website to kind of go into the next phase of our process, and that's going to provide some tools to kind of hopefully help the community understand the RHNA and kind of help us prioritize where type of sites or locations or densities or heights and all those characteristics that we should be looking at as we go forward and try to identify our housing sites. So going forward, we have, in addition to Diana Elrod, our housing consultant, we've hired an environmental consultant to prepare an environmental impact report, because each of the sites that we potentially change from whatever it is today to multifamily housing, we'll have to study potential environmental impacts, including traffic and noise and biological resources and cultural resources and services. And I know, a question we get quite often is how is, we're in a water shortage, how are we going to provide water? So part of the EIR will be speaking with our water providers and getting information about how they will serve any new developments. We're also working on some other less controversial parts of the housing element, which are just kind of factual updates on our housing stock and kind of demography and taking information from the recently released 2020 census. So once we prepare a draft housing element and have that complete, we have to submit it to the state HCD, again, who will review it. I believe that that 60 days has changed. They now are asking for 90-day review period. So we'll submit it for state review. They'll give it back to us with any comments, and then we'll have to make amendments to the housing elements to make sure that we're in compliance with state law. Then we'll start a public hearing process, and the housing element itself, as well as any general plan changes, rezonings, and the EIR needs to be complete by the end of January 2023. So the actual review process that we will be going through is, once we have a draft housing element and once we've gotten comments back from the state and made any modifications, we'll start going through a public hearing process, and that will start out with our planning commission. Our planning commission are 8 appointed individuals who are community members or volunteers that sit on that commission. They'll be reviewing it and they'll be making a recommendation on all those issues to the town council. Town council will ultimately be the body that will hold public hearings and adopt the housing element and any general plan, zoning, and the EIR changes that we will incorporate. And so at this point, I'm going to turn back to Diane, who's just going to talk a little bit more about the website that we're working on and some of the engagement tools that are going to be available. You're on mute, Diane.
Sorry about that. I'm an overmuter. So thanks, Dave. We do see some questions coming in, so keep them coming. We have launched an online engagement portal, and it is at www.danvilletowntalks.org. The express purpose of this online engagement portal is to serve as a source of facts about laws and processes, capture and respond to questions from our community. And these are it's unlike a social media type format or platform, because we can respond directly to your questions. And that is why this is so important, because we want to hear from you and we want to respond to you directly on some of your questions. Also, to really help inform the decision-making process with your ideas and your comments. Throughout this process, we are asking for your comments, your ideas, your feedback, and you can also participate in quick polls on this online forum. Next slide, please. We're missing a slide. Can you go back one? All right. Okay. All right. So, and you know, through the engagement portal, we invite your participation. You can subscribe to the news feed. You can learn about housing and its governing legislation to provide informed feedback for us. We're going to engage you by encouraging anyone that you know to attend any of these workshops. We are continuing to go out to community groups. If you have a community group where you would like Dave and I and Diana to come out to present, we'd be more than happy to do that. Asking questions either at or at the end of the online engagement portal. You know, take the surveys that we're sending out there. We sent a survey out in our newsletter, which went to over 16,000 homes. You know, contribute an idea, a housing story on how we can accommodate the assigned growth while retaining our special character. And in the spring, in continuing to do our outreach, we are going to launch an online interactive tool where our community members can actually go to the website and can participate in this interactive tool with some of where you think these housing units should go using our online interactive tool. And, you know, obviously where the housing units are going to go, it impacts different members of the community. So these are the things that we are launching in order to provide our planning commissioners and ultimately our town council with as much information about your comments, your thoughts about where these units should go in the decision during, you know, for the decision-making process. So we really encourage you to reach out to this portal. And as I said, there's the text information that is available. You can text us directly. It goes right to the online portal. Next slide, please. So, you know, what's next? We actually appealed the RHNA number. It's on to ABAG on September 24th. The appeal was denied. You know, as Judy mentioned early on, we are very actively involved in advocating on behalf of our community at the state level, at the local level, at the federal level. So, and we will continue to do that. And unfortunately, we did We did have our moment as far as the appeal, and it was denied, as most of them were and have been. It's been consistent throughout the state as we've watched these appeals play out that they have been denied. The state is very focused on housing units. Next slide, please. Oh, that's a little bit old. Sorry, folks. Next slide, please. Okay, if you are interested in participating in or learning about the types of legislation that are being implemented or introduced in the state, we are very actively involved with what is called the Tri-Valley Cities Coalition, which is Livermore, Pleasanton, Dublin, San Ramon, and the town of Danville. We work together as a region. Together, that contingency, those 5 cities represent pretty much close to 400,000 community members, which takes us up to a top 10 city in California. And we leverage that voice and we leverage those resources to really advocate on behalf of the town and the region. Your elected officials are Senator Steve Glazer, Assemblymember Rebecca Bauer-Cahan. We also have on our website a legislative framework. If you want to look at what the town's guiding legislative principles are, you can go under town council to our legislative advocacy work, and you can see how Danville advocates on behalf of the community. I also am the legislative liaison staff member within the Tri-Valley Cities Coalition, and I present a legislative update at the town council meeting every month. It is the second town council, which would be the 3rd week of every month, on a Tuesday night at 5 p.m. via Zoom. And we also have a legislative committee, which I present legislative bills and updates to our mayor and council member Stepper and our mayor Morgan, who are also on the committee, as well as our town manager Joe Calabrigo. So we present what is happening in California, the laws that are impacting Danville's ability to make local decisions. So if you are interested in what is happening, please join us at those different forums. And next slide, please. Okay, so here we are at questions and answers, and I see that we have a few questions that have come in. Can you repeat the name of the coalition? It's the Tri-Valley Cities Coalition, and it's comprised of Livermore, Pleasanton, Dublin, Danville, and San Ramon. We had a meeting last week, and that information, we hosted the meeting and it's published on our website. So you can call me, or you can go to the website and you could look at the Tri-Valley Cities Coalition. We also have a legislative framework through the coalition that's published on our website. So you can take a look at what we're doing from a state perspective, from a federal perspective, and from a regional perspective is how we're advocating on behalf of Danville. I have another question. Would tiny houses such as what Goodness Village has done in Livermore count toward our local needed houses?
Yeah, so I can take a stab at that. So yeah, tiny houses, apartments, condominiums, any unit at 30 units an acre will provide us, with 1 acre of our low and very low income needs. So yeah, depending on the density, those certainly, that's just another type of unit. I would also expand on that to, since we're getting some tiny houses that are being used as ADUs, accessory dwelling units, around town. And so, if we usually get the question about, do ADUs help us or count towards our RHNA number? And the answer is yes. Depending on the size, or maybe, there may be some need to establish what the market rate rentals are on them. But in general, yes. If we get 30 ADUs, qualifying ADUs in town, that's equal to 1 acre at 30 units an acre of housing. So if we can assume a certain number of ADUs per year and project that out over the 8-year cycle, that will help us somewhat. And I would also mention that ADUs seem to be a way of providing affordable housing that fits into neighborhoods well. And so we've tried to, both at the state level, they've continuously passed new laws that make them easier to build, and the town has also always, kind of tried to make ADUs something that can be done in residential areas. And so we've even gone out and created our own, what we'll call our garden cottage program, where we contracted with a couple of architects and we prepared ADU plans at 3 different sizes, I think about 800, 600, and around 1,000 square feet, each with different elevation treatments, craftsman style, Mediterranean, Spanish style. And so those plans are prepared, they're engineered, they're ready to be issued as building permits. So that would make them very, cheaper for anybody that wanted to use plans that the town has online. No need to hire an architect or to have structural engineers get involved. So.
Okay, next question. What are residents of all these new housing developments going to drink and use to wash their dishes and clothes? Seems with the drought and water depletion that the housing requirements are counterproductive to the current environmental situation.
Well, that's a question that everybody's asking, and that was part of a number of cities' appeals on the RHNA numbers that, we're in a drought, and is there going to be water available? So, we are within East Bay mud service boundaries, but again, as we go through this process and we determine where and how many units in Danville, we will be preparing an environmental impact report, and that will include dialogue with East Bay Mud to verify that they will be able to serve those developments.
Okay, let's see. We have another one. Can McGee Preserve be revisited, and it is if open space is now in jeopardy?
Can McGee Ranch be revisited? Well, I suppose there's a process. There's a process for everything. As far as the McGee Ranch project, that went through a pretty lengthy process, and they're out there beginning to grade and beginning to work on that project. So for that particular project, that was a planned unit development where all of the development potential of the 410 acres was clustered into a smaller portion of the site. So basically all development rights for the rest of the site was stripped away. So there are no development rights. So it would be permanent open space. The only way to change that would be to go back in and do a general plan change to add density back into it. And that is not, those types of open space areas are not the types of sites the town would be looking at for changing general plan for additional housing.
All right, we have another question. Can anyone buy these units, including investors?
I'm assuming you mean lower income units. The answer is no. They would be income qualifying. That is, that there would be a process in place where people who had lower incomes could apply for these units. Typically, most developments of affordable, like all affordable projects, are run by nonprofits whose job it is to create and maintain affordable housing. So even if a developer provides housing in, for example, like the Riverwalk property, the city can, or the town can require that that they provide documentation to prove that the lower income people are truly lower income, and they do a certification process. So no, an investor would not be allowed to buy individual units. They would, or rent individual units that would be to income qualifying households.
Okay, I don't see any questions. Judy, do you have any questions on your end?
I actually do, and I did want to, you mentioned the McGee Preserve, which many people know is near and dear to my heart because that open space component, and that is the question I'm getting the most, which is, can we open up any of our other projects, including this one, which was one of the last that was approved? And I guess perhaps it's a detailed question, because what would the process be to try to open up? And I can't see that that's something we would ever want to do, because Danville has been such a wonderfully planned city, town, if you will. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Are there circumstances where we would want to reopen? It doesn't seem like we would.
Yeah, I mean, most of Danville, since incorporation has been developed through that plan unit development and clustering approach, where all through down Sycamore Valley, we have taken whatever development potential there was and brought it down the hill along the boulevard and tried to keep development off of the hillsides. And if we were looking for multifamily sites, those hillside areas would not be the types of sites we'd be looking for, period, because they're not, they're just, you'd want sites close to transportation and sites that were somewhat compatible with surrounding developments and what have you. For something like McGee, there's multiple levels of protection on that project. Number one is that it's being dedicated to East Bay Regional Parks, so it's under a separate public entity. There's also scenic easements, protective easements, what have you. Also on most of the open space, it would be subject to Measure S here in Danville, which basically says that you can't change the general plan from agricultural or open space to anything else without a public vote. So, there could be some private open space areas that make sense along a boulevard or along a commute area that might be worth at least talking about. But certainly, open space like those types of projects that are amenities to the community, and on hillsides, wouldn't make any sense to even look at.
Okay, and then I had one other that I believe you answered, and then one beyond that, and then one other was about ABAG and your appeal. Is it correct that they denied all the appeals? Wasn't just Danville, there were like 12 others, weren't there?
They've only heard, I think, 5 or 6 appeals, and my understanding is that so far. They have a number of days where they're doing it. I believe all of them, including Lafayette, which I was involved with because I'm their housing element consultant as well, that was also denied. So I believe all of those from the first day were denied.
Okay, thanks for that. And then, on the same question, none of us want to see, I guess I could speak for most of us at the chamber in saying none of us would really like to see our hillsides and our open space jeopardized. One of the reasons we moved here was the hiking trails and the beauty of our town. How much space is actually available? And I wonder if you could just sort of elaborate on that piece a little bit. How much is available, and what are the other alternatives? Where are we going to put these 2241 homes?
Yeah, the open space areas are, not the areas we're going to focus on. So, the areas that make most sense, and, we're not at the point where we're identifying specific parcels or locations yet, but I think that the areas that will be under scrutiny will be older, underutilized office areas, maybe that have aged and aren't really as economically viable as they once were. Same thing with commercial strips or centers that may be older. So I think, it's not going to be going out to open areas. It's going to be repurposing urban areas already that we think that we can do where it may be more compatible with what's around it, and that, that type of thing. So, if you look at the couple thousand units and even a 30 units an acre, that's a lot of, do the math, it's a large number of acreage. So, and the other thing is it depends on, do we want to have more acreage, or do we want to have, at 30 units an acre, or do we want to have less acreage at 40 units an acre or higher? I think we all would agree that for the most part, especially in the downtown area, we have a special character that we've spent many years preserving and enhancing. And, you know, we have a height limit there, and we have a floor area ratio that all really fits in well. And so, you know, we probably don't want to do anything that's going to take away the character of the downtown area. So, you know, it's going to be focused in surrounding areas for the most part. And, you know, that's what we're kind of, one of the reasons we're here today is to get feedback on types of locations and densities and acreages, that type of thing.
That's all I see on my end. Diane, do you see anything else?
No, I don't. So we can pretty much just wrap it up by thanking everybody who was here. If you could spread the word, and also look, you know, please visit our Danville Town Talks. In the spring, we will be launching the interactive website. If you have any questions in the meantime, our information is available online at that website. And we hope everybody has a great afternoon. And thank you, Judy, for, you know, putting the word out and hosting this afternoon.
Well, and thank you to our businesses. I know it's tough to break away any time of day when you're running a small business, but thank you to our business leaders and employees that signed on today.
Yes, thanks so much.
All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You
Bye-bye.
too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.